Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the New York Times stage. My name's Lauretta Charlton. I am an editor on the national desk at the New York Times. I'm also responsible for the race-related newsletter, which is a weekly newsletter about race and identity that comes out every Saturday. And I hope you'll sign up. And with me, of course, he needs no introduction, but I'll do it anyway, is DeRay Mckesson. I'll just read, yes? I just want to read your bio really briefly. DeRay Mckesson is a civil rights activist, community organizer, and host of Crooked Media's award-winning podcast, Pod Save America. He started his career as an educator and came to prominence for his participation in and documentation of the Ferguson protests and the movement they birthed, and for publicly advocating for victims of police violence and to end mass incarceration. He's spoken at venues from the White House to the Oxford Union, at universities, and on TV. Named one of Time's 30 most influential people on the internet and number 11 on Fortune's World's Greatest Leaders list, he has received honorary doctorates from the New School and the Maryland Institute College of Art. A leading voice in the Black Lives Matter movement and the co-founder of Campaign Zero, a policy platform to end police violence, Mckesson lives in Baltimore and also maybe New York, is that right?
A little bit.
Awesome. So thank you for joining us. This is great, and this is not the first time DeRay and I have talked, so it's a pleasure to chat with you again. And I have with me a copy of your book, On the Other Side of Freedom, which came out last year, and I wanted to start just by asking you how it's been since the release last year.
It's been good. It's an honor to be here. It's my first time in Scotland, so thank you all for coming. It's cool. The cover in this part of the world looks a little different. It's my arrest photo. At home, it's a little more chill. But it's been good. You know, it's hard. The book tour is hard. I feel like I spent 3 years talking about the protests every single day. It was like the news, on Twitter, like everywhere. So the past 2 years or year-ish has been talking about the book, and it's sort of refreshing in some ways not to have to defend the protests every 2 seconds and to talk about other set of stories. I would be lying if I said I wasn't tired. I'm a little tired. It's been a long 5 years. You know, August 9th was actually 5 years since the protests began. We were in the street for 400 days. It was a long 400 days. So it's good to be talking to somebody I know. We did a book talk in Portland, Oregon in front of a couple thousand people, and that was great. So it's good to be back.
Yeah. So what are you most proud of, though, after the publication of this book? Like, what have you seen that you're just really excited to have happened after the publication?
I think that the thing is, you know, raise your hand if you've written a book. Any authors here? Writing a book is like dying.
I would expect more, yeah.
So in some ways it was like, I'm just happy I got it out. You know, it was like there were all these stories and I was like, I'm happy I got them out, and they don't exist just on Twitter, or they're not things that are just like swarming around in my mind, like they just exist in the public. You know, I think about one of the essays that didn't get published in the book that I want to figure out what to do with. We just couldn't sort of fix it in time. It was titled in my head, We Become Experts at Saying Goodbye. Because I think in so many ways, because of the protests and because of the deaths, that there's like a ritual to death now, that like somebody dies, we know how to organize around it, we know what to say on the news. It's just like we become experts at saying goodbye. And that essay begins with, I've had 5 people in my life commit suicide. And one of the people who took their lives was a boy. He was a 7th grader. I opened up an after-school program in Baltimore, and he hung himself in the bathroom. And I'll never forget going to his funeral because the casket was so small. And I think about, that essay begins with, I can always hold the tears back until the casket closes. Because there's something about when the casket closes at a funeral that just feels like the end to me. And I want to write about that one day. Like, what does it mean that we become experts at saying goodbye? But otherwise, the book it's good that it's out in the world.
Good. So you are working on another book already, it sounds
No, I don't know, the book, an essay. The book almost killed me. But definitely a set of essays. There's so many things I want to figure out how to like talk about in the public space, you know?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I know that we've been looking into the fact that Black youth suicide is actually quite alarming. And when we say youth, we're saying like you said, 7 years old. I mean, it's actually the Congressional Black Caucus is looking into studying it a little bit more. So 5 years ago, since Michael Brown died, what do you think has changed in Ferguson and the United States in terms of the energy that was seen on the streets and the protests? What do we have to show for Ferguson 5 years later?
I think that the hard part is that people often confuse a change in conversation with a change in outcomes. And I think that what we did really well was change the conversation. The conversation about race and justice in the country is just so different than it was, which is a good thing. I think the conversation about prisons, about policing is at a whole different space than it used to be. The outcomes haven't really changed as much as we wanted them to. A third of all the people killed by a stranger in the United States is actually killed by a police officer. This is the first year ever where Black people are more afraid of being killed by a police officer than being killed by community violence, which is really wild. And the police have actually killed more people in the United States since the protests, not less, which is also really wild. But the conversation has changed, and that is a net positive. I think about the civil rights movement was a decade-long worth of activism, that it took a decade before there were real substantive wins. I think about us in year 5, that I hope the next 5 years. What I will say too is that I think that some of the work is about structures and systems, and I'm a structures guy. We got to change the rules, the policies, the systems. I think the other part is how do we give people language to think about the world differently? And I do think that has been a big part of what the movement has done well. So when we talk to people about sort of the police, it's if I asked all of you to close your eyes and imagine the place where you feel the most safe. It's if you do that, the police probably aren't in that place. The police probably aren't in the room where you feel the most safe. And it's we want to build that world for everybody. When we talk about abolition, people often think about abolition as the end of prisons, and they're well, what about criminals? And it's I used to teach 6th grade math, and 6th grade was great. 6th grade is the best grade. 7th grade is puberty and deodorant, but 6th grade is really beautiful. And the cool thing about being a teacher was that there were some moments where it was beautiful, and then there were some moments where it was you just had to get out of class. You got to go to the office, you got to go stand in the hallway, something that it just isn't working right now. But I understood the difference between sending you to the principal's office and locking you in a cage. And that prison is locking kids in cages, right? And sending you to the principal's office is about saying that I get that there are moments where people have to be separated from society, and that is not the same thing as putting somebody in a cage. And so much of I think what the protest did really well was give people new language to think about the world around us. And I think that will be a net win for a generation.
I want to follow up with that. So language is incredibly important, and I think out of Ferguson we've seen words like white privilege become just part of everyday conversation. And another one is woke. I was at a barbecue the other day, and I was talking to a professor, and he was woke is sort of shorthand for, being a little bit aware. Would you agree with that definition? What is your definition of wokeness?
It's, this question reminds me that the protests are cool now. Being a protester is sort of a cool thing, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It is a bad thing when it just becomes a fad. I think about when we were in the street in 2014, it was not cool. People told us to go home. It was rough. And I'm thankful I can be here today, but I remember when I was sleeping in the basement of my friend's house for 3 years, it was a rough beginning. And I think about the phrase woke to me, I'm reminded that we aren't born woke, something wakes us up, that everybody has had a moment of awakening about the world around them. I think the word can be a little cliche, but I don't criticize people for that sometimes. I'm okay with however people decide to tell the truth in public, whatever that looks like, I'm okay with it. But I think about from a definition standpoint that woke is sort of an acknowledgement that the world can be better and that people sort of see that differently.
That's a good one. So let's see. So would you agree that the energy, though, from the streets has turned into political power? I know that you ran for mayor in Baltimore, but Fran Griffin is also someone who ran for city council in Ferguson and recently won. I mean, are these political actions a direct result of what happened on the streets and the protests and the sort of violence and...
Yeah, I think that we understood in the street that the goal of protest wasn't more protests, right? The goal of protest was to win. We wanted to win structural things. So we stood in the street and put our bodies on the line because we were this is the only way we'll bring attention to a crisis, And there is this acknowledgement that we have to be as organized on the inside as we are on the outside, that if all we do is fight on the outside, we'll never actually win, that we actually have to be the people in the positions of power so we can make the changes that we want, which is why I ran, it's why Fran ran, it's why
Wesley Bell.
and then what's his name, who just resigned in St. Louis? Bruce, why Bruce Franks was a state senator. So a ton of people. I think it's like why we acknowledge that. I also am reminded of sort of the other side, and I am pretty cheery about the world, but it's been a hard 5 years in a lot of ways. My phone was hacked. I was on a panel, and I normally travel with more than one phone, and this one phone, in the middle of the panel, it goes, please activate your phone. And I'm like, that's really weird. I've never seen please activate your phone before. So I turn it off, turn it back on, and it still says it. And what I realized really quickly is that at home, Verizon, which is one of our big phone companies, somebody called Verizon, posed as me. My social security number got dumped on the internet. They got my PIN card changed over the phone, which I didn't even know you could do, and my SIM card changed over the phone. And then they reset every account that they could find of mine online. And the two-factor code got sent to that phone number, not mine. So they hacked into my Twitter, my Gmail, all this stuff. That was crazy. A movie theater got evacuated because somebody said they were going to shoot me. If you remember WikiLeaks, which we're still recovering from, I was in one of the first WikiLeaks dumps. There was this thing about Hillary Clinton, so people think I got paid to support Hillary. That was a nightmare. It's been I got arrested in Baton Rouge, which is actually this photo. And after this arrest, I got sued by 5 police officers in 2 states for inciting a riot. This one officer got hit by a rock, and he said that I'm responsible for all his damages. We got all 5 cases dismissed, and then an appeals court actually overturned the dismissal. So I'm still in this legal limbo with the appeals court. So it's been and the first person ever permanently banned from Twitter was actually banned for raising money to try and get me killed. So it's been a special 5 years.
Are you still in touch with Jack Dorsey?
I am.
Yeah, what is he up to these days?
He's running Twitter and Square. Jack and I don't always agree about the way Twitter sort of is dealing with hate. I'm reminded, though, that Twitter is the only of the public social media platforms. So you actually need an account to look at Facebook. You need an account to look at Snapchat. You need an account to look at TikTok. You need an account to look at Instagram. You actually don't need an account to look at Twitter. People forget that Twitter is a public sort of page. You need an account to go back and forth with people on Twitter, but you actually don't need an account to look at Twitter. So I think it changes the way that Twitter sort of performs in the public space. I am also mindful that a lot of people are bad before they come to Twitter, right? And that's not Twitter's fault. Twitter has a responsibility to make sure that the bad people don't get to organize on the platform. So we fight about those things a lot, but I just saw him at Essence Fest in New Orleans. I think he's doing well. He owns Square, he runs Square too, and Square is an important platform for a lot of people. So I think he's good.
Cool. So we talked about the political power that's come out of Ferguson, but there's also this level of power on celebrity, right? I know that you have been called a celebrity activist. How are you adjusting to life as a celebrity? Do you
Why
feel?
don't you be a celebrity?
He's a celebrity, right?
I struggle with this. I think that people, especially my critics, use the celebrity activist thing to divorce me from the work, right? This idea that I'm a celebrity, therefore I cannot do any work. And I think that I'm somebody who built a platform because of the work, used the platform to do the work. People see me with people who are actual celebrities, and they think that that's all I do. And it's the reality is I'm the annoying guy at the party being hey, Diddy, what about the, I'm always trying to figure out how do we get you to do something really interesting around Black people or interesting around justice. And what is also funny is that a lot of celebrities, when I'm around them, they get so nervous that they perform wokeness that I'll walk in and they'll be every time I see Dave Chappelle, every single time, he literally walks up to me, he goes, Black Lives Matter too. And you're okay, Dave, good to see you. You're what is it? Or he'll be Black Lives do matter. And you're I literally just said hi, so that becomes a funny thing, but I want to believe that I use a platform to help expose people to new voices. If any of you went to Casey's talk last night, Casey's amazing. We did that talk, and even being a selector here, being able to invite other authors to be in front of crowds is how I think about using the platform. But people definitely do divisively call me a celebrity activist. I think of myself as an activist who just has a platform.
Right. So one of my favorite sections of the book is about whiteness. And so I wanted to focus on some of what I find to be the most compelling quotes on this subject in the book and get you to elaborate on them a little bit more. I have page numbers if you need me.
It's funny writing the book was so hard that sometimes I hear quotes from it and I'm like, I really like that. And then I'm like, I wrote that. I'm like, woo! Because I really did write it, but it was really hard. I can't even tell you. And then anybody who wants to write a book, my advice to you is, most editors actually won't look at a manuscript until it's all done, which is like not how I wrote anything else in life. Like I turned in a paper and turned in the paper. I didn't turn in 10 papers, force your editor to give you feedback early. So I turned in like the whole book, and then she sent back like 10 lifetimes worth of feedback, and I was like, ah! So every time I open it, I can see like red marks where she was like, we need to change this. Okay, but go ahead, I'm ready. Still scarred.
Editing is also hard. It's hard to do that, to be the bad guy sometimes. But let's start with this one. I've grown tired of the notion of an ally. I prefer the language of an accomplice. An ally loves you from a distance. An accomplice loves you from up close. So I'm reading these quotes as they relate to this section in the book about whiteness. So do you want to talk a little bit about what that means?
So this chapter is called The Choreography of Whiteness. I'm interested in the way that whiteness sort of dances around people. We think about white supremacy as a smog, right? And one of the ways that smog works is that we all inhale it whether we want to or not. And part of our work is to make sure that when we inhale it, that we don't exhale it and that we see it, that we know what's happening and that we don't replicate it back in the world. So in that part, it's like, people talk about being an ally, but an ally is somebody who's like, hope you get free, believe, and accomplice is somebody who's like standing next to you, like, let us work together, And there are a lot of people who love you from a distance who are like, hope that ends, hope the border's okay, It's like, we actually don't, that's not love, like that is sort of interesting and it's better than nothing, but it's not actually it's not what the most people can do is.
Mm-hmm. And when you say that, are you sort of talking about like well-meaning white people who may be liberal or maybe progressive, but they're not necessarily, let's see, their behavior may not show a serious commitment to dismantling these structures? So
or it's people who aren't willing to put anything on the line. They're like, I actually don't get a choice to talk about race. When I talk about race, people think that that's all I do, but it's like, I didn't make this about race. Race made this about me. I would love to not have to talk about this stuff all day long, but that's just not the world I live in. There are a lot of white people who get the choice to talk about race. They get the choice to deal with these issues, and it's like, you should actually choose to do it. So at home, I won't remind you that our president's a little crazy, and it is rough at home. And there are a lot of people who look at what's happening on the border and they're like, hope those people are okay. And you're like, that's just not good enough, right? That part of it is actually figuring out what you can do to end the crisis, however you can end the crisis. And there are a lot of people who, what's interesting about most of the way people think about allies is that they want medals and badges for doing the most basic stuff, right? So they're like, I put that Facebook post up, I'm an ally, as if we're supposed to run to them and be like, thank you so much, I can't believe you. And it's like, that actually is sort of an easy thing to do, right? That we want to figure out what you're willing to risk so that people can experience freedom.
Mm-hmm. Here is another question, or another section in that, another quote in that section that I really like. Some have said that whiteness traffics in distractions, and I think this may be true, but the distraction is a deception. Is in deception and pushing you to ignore whiteness's investment in itself and never ask whiteness to do for others what it has done for white people. Can you unpack that sentence here?
I like that sentence. Forgot about that one. Toni Morrison is famous for talking about the chief focus of racism is actually distraction, which I believe is true. But there is this acknowledgement that part of the distraction is deception, that at home...
Can you just say R.I.P. Toni Morrison?
I know. Beloved is one of the most lyrical texts I've ever read. I didn't know words could do that until Toni. But I think one of the sort of ways that whiteness is so insidious is that whiteness will never do for other people what it's done for itself. So I was talking to somebody at the book festival recently actually about land redistribution. And their sort of push was it'd be really hard to redistribute the land because it's 5 generations later and it's people who live on the land today who didn't actually do the bad thing. And I was saying to him well, you actually are benefiting from, you're 5 generations later benefiting from the bad thing too, right? So you actually don't get to pick and choose. At home, it's the same thing that you think about, what does it mean? I was at a party once. This is not a humble brag. This is just the context. Beyonce's mom has a party every year, and I'm at this party, And it's a wearable art gala, so like you wear a piece of art. So I'm wearing this like clear jacket that has these like 4 facts about justice. Because like if I'm going to a party, I'm at least gonna bring the work, right? So this one fact is that we arrest more people for weed than all violent crimes combined, which is true. And one of the other facts is that white high school dropouts have more wealth than all black college graduates, which is also true. And this guy at the party, and it's Beyonce's mom's party, so everybody there is like a who's who of something. So this guy walks up to me, and he's like a big record exec, and he goes, "Are these true?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he points to one about wealth. And he's like, "Well, I don't think that's true." And I'm like, "I don't know if you get to not think, I mean, it's true. Like, this is like what it is, right?" And he's like, "Well, DeRay, you know, the only reason that white people have more wealth is that there are more white people." And I'm like, we're at a party though, so I'm like, what am I gonna say to this man? Like, I don't. So I go, you know, the only reason there are more white people is that you killed half the people and enslaved the other half. And he was like, and he's like, I don't. I was like, you definitely don't get not to know that. That is like that happened, right? Like you killed the Native Americans, enslaved black people. But there was this reminder that like so much of the way that white supremacy sort of works is that it traffics in denial, right? That like it always wants to pretend that like white just sort of got here and then everybody else must have made a series of bad decisions. And it's like, no, like poverty is not the result of a series of bad decisions by individuals. It is like what happens when you steal everything from people and then are like, go eat. You're like, well, how does that work, right? And I wanted to name that I worry that people interpret Tony's quote about distraction to mean a host of things and not necessarily like deception, but whiteness like traffics in deception.
Mm-hmm. So I have 2 more on this subject of whiteness. The distinction between whiteness and white people is important because whiteness is an idea made flesh. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, this is one, it's funny, I would do all these interviews and people would bring this up and it'd be like, I want you to read the chapter. But when I think about this section, it was, because what happens is I'll get people who are like, I didn't do it. They're like, I didn't enslave anybody. You're like, got it, I know, thank you. And trying to help people understand that like white supremacy functions as an ideology and it functions in its own way systemically and institutionally. And then there are people who are white. And people who are white can choose to participate in the way the institutional machinations of white supremacy work, or there are people who can be white, people who are white who can choose to disrupt those things. And there are people who like sort of there are people who want to sort of do this thing that's like, to be white means to be white supremacist. That is not true. But to be white means to benefit from white supremacy. That is true, but people can disrupt that. So trying to name this idea that like, this idea of an idea made flesh, that like race is a construct. And if you were at the Ibram conversation, Ibram has this really interesting thing. Somebody in the audience said, do you think about these things as social constructs? And what Ibram said is that he was like, I think about them as power constructs. That like when we call them social constructs, it makes it seem like everybody participated in their creation. When we call them power constructs, we are mindful that people in power created these things so that they would always maintain power. And I think that that is true. So trying to name that like white people can be well-meaning and good and can do a lot of work to disrupt these things, and that is actually the best of what people can do.
Mm-hmm. The last one, whiteness is an idea and a choice. I think this just reiterates what you just said now. We can choose differently. We can introduce new ideas to replace whiteness. We have the tools to build something altogether new.
Yeah, I'm interested. People ask me why I'm so hopeful, given that the world is so not great, and because we are struggling at home. Trump, you know, what's interesting about Trump, I was at a dinner right before Trump got elected, and somebody said to me, if Trump wins, undoing the damage he caused will be like trying to unring a bell. And I thought that was like the best metaphor, because nobody thought that the president could do as much as the president's done and do it daily. Like every day there's something new. And you're like, I didn't even know the president could arrest 600 people at an elementary school. You're like, I didn't know these things could happen. When I think about this idea of a choice, you know, sometimes we say the system is broken and people say, oh no, it was designed to be that way. And my takeaway from that is that it was designed, you know? People made this up, and because people made it up, we can make something better. That we think about these systems as present, not permanent. And there are a lot of people who think about the world as like a permanent, it's like just like a permanent thing. And we think about these things as present. Poverty is present, not permanent. Like hunger is present, not permanent. Homelessness is present, not permanent. Like we could actually make a host of choices to change all of these things. You think about at home, Trump just gave $700 billion to the military. It would take $100 billion to take every single person out of poverty. it's never a matter of resources, it's always a matter of will.
So I'm glad that you are hopeful, and it seems like a particularly tough time. We've had a series of mass shootings already this year, and several of them were explicitly motivated by white supremacy. And so you talk about doing the work a lot, and the various ways that you try and call people into the work. In terms of these rising acts of terrorism across the world, how does the work relate to that, and how we're addressing it?
I think that, I was talking to a friend the other day, and we had this conversation about this is probably how Rome fell, that like everybody was like, everything's great, it'll just work itself out. And then it's like, and there's no Rome. And I think about at home, there are a lot of people who are like, oh, it'll just work itself out. And it's like, it only works itself out because people work it out. Like that is like how it happens. And then I'm always reminding people that the numbers are on our side, that more people did not vote for that man than voted for that man. The question is like, can we organize the people on our side? Like that will be our task. And there's days when I'm like, we're on a good track. And then there are days when I'm like, we are far away. So I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out like, what are those, like, how do we take those lessons? And you have your own problem here now. So sorry about that. I'm sure we helped inspire that guy. Sorry. But it's like, I think that some of the lessons that I've learned are a few, is that we have to fight for the world we think we deserve, not the world we think we can get. That there are a lot of people who walk into the room sort of already having negotiated and bargained, only fighting for what they think they can walk out the room with. The other side is always fighting for exactly what they want. And like part of what we have to do is like fight for what we want every single time and what we think we deserve. I think what the right at home does really well is that it's always like elites talking to regular people. The left at home is always elites talking to elites. So I'm always trying to figure out, like, if my aunt can't understand it, then it doesn't matter. So whenever I'm putting together a message, it's like, if I can't tell my aunt, who's not stupid, but my aunt is busy, she's not watching CNN or MSNBC or the BBC, she's not watching any of these things, she got a lot going on. So when Kavanaugh was a Supreme Court justice who was accused of sexual misconduct. When the Kavanaugh hearings were happening, I was not calling my aunt saying, you know what, Aunt Mink, Roe v. Wade, a woman's right to choose is on the block. If you remember with Kavanaugh, he used to work in the White House and they hid all those papers, like they wouldn't release any of the papers from him in the White House. So when I called Aunt Mink, I was like, Aunt Mink, they hiding the papers. This man trying to be in the Supreme Court and they hiding the papers. She was like, they hiding the papers? I'm like, girl, they hiding the papers. It is bad. I'm like, and she was like, they can't hide the papers. I'm like, they sure can't hide the papers. What they hiding? And she was like, they hiding some. I'm like, they are hiding some, I mean. But it was like, I needed to figure out how to like get her into it. Because once I got her in, then I could say, and he don't even believe in a woman's right to choose. She was like, he don't? I'm like, girl, it's bad out here. But it was like, part of our work is to create entrances and on-ramps for people and not to be so arrogant to believe that the only way to enter is the way we enter. And I think there are a lot of people who do justice work who are really arrogant and righteous in some ways, who think that the only way you can enter into the issue is the way I enter. And I used to be one of those people. I used to think that if you talk about the police and you don't talk about race or justice, then like you don't care, you don't get it. And now I get that there are a lot of people across the country who fairness is sort of the way they think about policing, and I'm okay with that. Whatever your entrance is, like, I know that I gotta get you in so I can move you. The third is like, people have heard the phrase like crabs in a barrel, this idea that we're sort of taking each other down. And like one of the things I'm more mindful of is this idea that the barrel is actually not the crab's natural habitat, right? That there's actually enough space in the water. And we have to build an organizing world that says like there's enough space in the water for everybody and not reify this idea of crabs in a barrel. So I think there are a lot of lessons that I've learned in the past 5 years about how we actually get to the other side of freedom and what do we do to sort of push back on this rise of this negative populism that's spreading across the world.
Mm-hmm. And as you've been traveling on your book tour, what are people saying? What are people asking you about in terms of your perception of what's going on in the U.S.? I'm sort of curious what the most common question is for you.
They're like, is Trump really crazy? Yes. It's interesting. Trump is fascinating in a lot of ways because he reminds me of people's desire to believe. So Trump will do something moderately not bad. He won't do anything good, but it'll be like moderately less bad than the last thing. And people will be like, oh, it's a good day for the president. You're like, what? You're like, no good days. This is like all bad, So that's been interesting to me. People ask about the police. I think it's hard for people to believe that the police kill as many people at home as they do. That has been sort of an interesting thing. People ask me, I write about my mother in the book, and people have read it, asked me about why I chose to write about her. She left when I was 3, came back when I was 30. I read about being gay and what it means to be a gay black man in the movement. I read about that chapter. So people ask me about those things because I don't normally talk about them in interviews unless people ask, you know?
You also talk about meeting Hillary Clinton in this book. We have a Democratic presidential primary going on right now with a whole slate of candidates. You've met with Hillary, you've met with Bernie. Tell us about sort of what you think is happening in that sphere, in the political sphere, and social justice work.
Hillary was good, everybody. Hillary was fine. You know, our first meeting with her was not good. She was like a little shaky. You're like, yikes. Second meeting with her, she was excellent, and she was so good about the things we cared about that her team actually wouldn't release the video of them, and it was really frustrating because one of the downsides of Hillary is that there are so many people in the Clinton world, there's so many people with a lot of power, and that means that you never really know who's making the decision. So somebody would tell us something, and then somebody else would tell us something else, and like that was sort of a nightmare. Obama, the longest meeting Obama ever had in the White House was actually with us, which was interesting. It was 4 hours. It was a long, long meeting. And one of the things I'll never forget from the Obama meeting is how disappointed I was in the civil rights community, that people walked into that room with a lot of things. They didn't always walk in with the truth. So in that meeting, one by one, people went around and said thank you to President Obama. And the protesters, we were like, what you thanking him for? He hasn't done anything about the police. You know, like he literally had done nothing about the police. And we like Obama, but people were not very honest with him. People we love. Like there's one civil rights leader who I really loved before that meeting. And Obama asked him, what do we do? And he was like, we need a revolution of love. And I'm sitting here like, get him out the meeting. They're like, somebody go pick this man up and throw him. Like, a revolution of love is crazy. Like, they are killing people. You talk about love. So that was actually a really interesting thing about Obama. And it reminded me that people are not actually willing to tell the truth in every room. When I think about this presidential cycle, you've seen, 20 people running for president, literally, so it's a lot of people. I've talked to Castro, Buttigieg, Kamala, Corey. We talked to Warren's team, because we want to talk to our team first, and talk to Biden's team. We probably won't be talking to Marianne Williamson. Love Marianne Williamson's writings. Her as a candidate's a little shaky. Andrew Yang a little shaky. Tulsi a little shaky. So there's some people we're not talking to, but most of the people we talk to are sort of good about issues of policing, criminal justice. Some people I'm willing to do bold things. So I like Pete as a person. Pete's platform is very moderate. So like Pete's platform is all the stuff we've already agreed to already. So there's not really a bold idea, but it's like, if you are moderate, he's like your guy. Castro is really good out there on the police. Biden, what is really weird about Biden is that for somebody, he's been in office literally longer than I've been alive. And you wouldn't know that from his platform. So that is sort of hard. And Kamala, I like Kamala. I think what's interesting about Kamala in a hard way is that she is the only person up there who is a legitimate expert on civil rights. Like that is her, she was a prosecutor. Her sister used to lead the ACLU in California. I mean, she has it, and she has no platform on criminal justice. Like she's committed to very few things about criminal justice or policing, and like that is a glaring omission on her part. We met with her, and she was great though. Like a lot of reporters don't like her. They think she's really defensive, and she is really sort of contrarian in meetings. But with us, she was good. She we asked her a lot of questions, tough questions about her record. She answered them. She sort of pushed back. We pushed. It was a good meeting. So we'll see. I'm probably not going to write about the election until we have less than 20 candidates. So.
Buttigieg he had that backlash, right, in his hometown where there was a confrontation with police officers, and the feeling was he didn't respond quickly enough, and that he wasn't talking about race enough. Do you agree with that?
I think that the hard thing about Pete is like, if you have struggled to figure out how to do it in a town of 10,000 people, how will you do it in the country, right? And I think that's sort of like a fair critique of Pete, and I don't think Pete has sort of offered a great understanding of that. We talked to him about some of the police stuff. It's a small town. It's a really black town. They killed a kid. And and they haven't sort of figured out how to respond. So I don't know. I like Pete. Again, Pete is like a moderate stream. It's like he is, when you look at the platform, it is literally all the things we've already agreed to over the past 4 or 5 years, and he just named them different things and put a bow around them, and it works, you know? It works with people it works for. What's really interesting about Pete, and this is really not a knock, I'm legitimately fascinated by this, is that Pete has 0% support amongst black people, like zero, literally zero, and is still one of the top candidates. And I just don't even know how that's possible. That's like fascinating to me. And Pete has raised more money than almost all the candidates, but literally with 0% support amongst black people. And I didn't know somebody could stay alive like that. So I am interested, I'm fascinated by the phenomenon of what Pete represents to some people.
Awesome. So I'm going to ask you a few more questions, but also wanted to let everybody know we're going to open it for Q&A as well. So prepare your questions about the book. So returning to the content of the book, many activists have talked about the toll of protests, of civil rights activism, mental health issues. It's definitely something I think about when I'm assigning stories on race. I'm also trying to, remember that stories about race don't always have to be really sort of heavy and negative, but there is a toll. And you in the book write about feeling suicidal and a lot of sort of mental health issues that you've had related to protests, but also just in your life. And I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that and what you do to kind of gird yourself for the kind of work that you do.
Yeah, I think I'm still trying to figure it out. I spent 5 years, I spent 3 years fully around strangers. Like I was just in always new places and a new something, and that took a toll on me that I didn't understand until recently. So I try to spend most of my time around people I know and love already. So that is a good thing. I can normally reset in a room with 4 walls and a door. Like I can just like recenter, reset. I don't need a whole lot. Some people need like vacations. I need like 4 walls and I'm sort of good. I think the other thing is I was talking to Netta about this. I was with Netta a lot during the protest, and we sort of joked that like for all the money that's been spent after the protest, I wish that somebody had gotten everybody a therapist. Like that probably would have been like the better of everything, because we all are like a little scarred. It was, I don't know, and I feel like the book, I try to do this in the book, but I don't know if I'll ever be able to convey how wild it was. Like what was it like to sit on the floor when we did a sit down inside of a police department, and this police officer walks up to me as I'm sitting, and she puts her hand on her taser, and she's just looking at me, and it's this moment of like, you could tase me from like 2 feet away, you could shoot me, like, and we're just here, and we're like not going anywhere, right? Or what was it like to be dragged out of that police department by my ankles? Or when I was arrested in this moment, I was in jail for 19 hours. I didn't plan to get arrested, so my friends got me out. Like, luckily they were there too. Or the night that we got pepper sprayed because the police didn't know how to use their pepper spray, so they sprayed it, and then the wind blew it back on them, and they thought that we pepper sprayed them. We were like, why don't we pepper spray y'all? So they pepper sprayed themselves, and then they got mad at us and pepper sprayed us. It was there were so many nights that were just so wild, and I don't know how I'll ever convey that to people who weren't there. And like in the early days, we didn't know if we'd survive, so we would write these letters to our families and put them in the drafts of our Twitter, so that if somebody found our phone later, people would know that we loved them. Like that was crazy, We would text each other our passwords in case one of us didn't come home that night, and it was just so wild. And only now am I like remembering those things because I spent so long trying not to remember them. I remember when the police killed somebody in this town. I go to the town. I get there at like 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm supposed to stay at this guy's house, my sister's friend. He doesn't answer the door. I'm tired. I go to sleep in the driveway. I wake, there were so many of those moments that were just so wild that we made work. And even like I think about the sacrifices in America, I don't know how credit works over here, like your credit score, but at home, credit scores sort of exist in a 7-year cycle, which I didn't know. So I quit my job with no plan. I had no health insurance. I depleted my retirement. Like, I just did it because I was like, I think this is the right thing to do, and I will be paying for that decision for the next 6 years. But I like defaulted on my student loans because I was like, I'll figure it out. And then I was like, I didn't pay my credit card bills. Like, I really did just go cold turkey because I was like, I believe in this work, And in hindsight, I'm like, I don't really know if that was always the best idea. So I really had to figure out like what does that mean. But I just went to Disney World with my sister and my niece and nephew, and that was great. Disney World is cool. Disney has its own problems, but like Disney World is fine. So that was really fun, and to see kids be so. My niece and nephew are 7 and 8. And just adorable, you know, like I took this black and white photo that I think is a really cool photo. My niece sees it and she asked my sister, she's like, why is Uncle DeRay gray? And I'm like, I could kill you, you know, like I'm not gray, it's black and white, Selah. So it's cute, like kids are cute. And I want to go back to teach one day. I love teaching. Like the kids I taught 12 years ago, the kids I taught are like 21, which is crazy. But I would love to go back and like teach or like work with kids again. Like that was one of the big joys of my life.
I think out of Ferguson, like the book The Hate You Give, which is now a movie, that really, I think that came out of the energy of Ferguson and young kids being awakened to this moment. So what kind of advice do you give to young people who want to participate but maybe definitely should not stop paying student loans and and they're not going to be out in the street protesting. Like, what do you say to young people who want to be involved?
I think a couple things. One is remember that anything that's ever changed the world started in a living room, a kitchen, a basement, or a porch. That like it never starts off big. The first thing I ever did in the protest was make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and I made amazing peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in a living room. Like that is actually how any big idea starts. The second is, you know, the chapter about my mother is called I Can Remember Her Now Without Sadness. So my mother left when I was 3, came back when I was 30. And one of the reasons that I write about her is that what I realized, and I actually realized this during the book tour, the first set of the book tour, was that one of the reasons I wrote about her, and I probably should have written this sentence down, but I realized that I was always carrying this idea of what did it mean to be worthy into every room I went into, because it was like if she could leave, then anybody could leave. And if I wasn't worthy enough for her to stay, then like I wouldn't be worthy for anybody to stay. And she was dealing with addiction, so it wasn't like she just like up and left. It was addiction that caused her to leave. But I realized that as an adult, like I was making all these decisions because I'd never felt worthy. And I needed that feeling of worthiness to like help me out in the world. So my advice to people, young and old, is like to think about what are you carrying with you into the rooms you walk into, because the more and more you interrogate like the things you carry into the room, the better you can do the work. And it took me a long time to realize that part of Joan's leaving meant that I was always preparing for people to leave me, and I was always sort of struggling with this idea of like self-worth and what did it mean to be worthy. The third thing is a reminder that like the work is hard and all that jazz, because it is, but joy is also a part of what we do. And I think that the protests are really beautiful because like we had a lot of fun, you know, in the midst of the chaos. Like there were drummers, there were chants, like there was a lot of stuff to keep the joy high. And I think that sometimes people think that, you know, I meet some people and they think that I'm going to be so serious and I'm going to be like justice, like that is like how I walk into the room, and I'm pretty happy, you know, like because I realize that like the joy has to be a part of how we do the work too. It can't just be like fight the power, fight the police all day long.
So we have some time for questions. I can also, DeRay and I can continue our conversation, but do you want to just raise your hand? Yes. There are mics.
Hi, thank you very much. It's really inspiring and wonderful to hear you in person. Just a quick question. There's a lot of, as you know, kind of movements for different aspects of justice happening around the world, and many people see the connections currently unfolding with the negative populism, as you call it. To what extent has the Black Lives Matter or yourself or kind of others involved in the movement been connected with some of these other conversations in other countries? Just for your own knowledge, I recently spoke with a young South African activist protesting against kind of private or corporate takeover of kind of the government and communities and schools. And she actually referenced the Black Lives Matter movement and you in particular as sources of inspiration. And so I wonder, you know, have you yourself been involved in making some of those connections? Has the movement been involved in some of those connections? Or do you see this more, you know, with the platform that people are just being able to see and draw inspiration from different protests and movements going on around the world at this time? Thanks.
Yeah, I'm really mindful that it's such an American thing to do to try and like tell everybody else how to fix their problems before you fix your own, right? So I didn't travel out of the country for the first 3 years because like, what can I tell you? You know, like I could give like a cute speech about something, but like we haven't won yet. Do you know what I mean? And I'm really sensitive about like it's such an American thing to do, to travel across the world being like, here's how you fix the thing we couldn't fix, or like the thing that we actively allowed to be a problem, right? So I don't travel as much to like tell other people as much as I'm like, I've learned from, I just did this conversation with Boniface Mwangi, who's one of the leading activists in Kenya, right? And like, I'm inspired by Bobby Wine in Uganda and like so many other people. Their activism has inspired me, but I'm always mindful that we haven't won yet. It is really sobering on my soul that the police have killed more people since the protests began, not less. That is like every time I say it, it like reminds me of the work ahead, and that like really pains me. But I'm mindful, and the first time I was in the UK, I met with activists here who helped me understand that the problem with the police in the UK was actually like border police, right? Like, which is something, our border patrol is a nightmare now because of Trump, but they were not necessarily bad in this sort of way before like this. So short answer is I don't travel as much because we haven't figured it out, and I don't want to be that American who travels telling everybody how to fix something we couldn't do yet.
Gentleman in the back, yep.
Yes, one of the things that seems to have been stolen from black people is the vote. And I'm wondering what you think about the efforts to redress this and how that's going.
Yeah, this is actually one of my fights with Obama. So after we had the meeting with Obama, I walk up to him and I say two things. One is, I don't know if you remember the protests in Baltimore. Obama gets on the news and there was property damage in Baltimore. People burned down some things. And Obama gets on the news and he calls them thugs, right? So I walk up to him, it's just he and I go to him, I'm like, Obama, you can't call people thugs. Just like that. And he is like, DeRay, in a very, Obama is interesting because he really does, everything you see on TV, like that is him. Like the words come out very slow and like very methodical, and you're like, okay. And so he's like, DeRay, you've said things on TV you shouldn't say. And I'm like, okay. And I go, yeah, but I'm not the president. And he's like, you're right. And I was like, I know I'm right. But the second thing I said to him, he kept saying, like, if you believe in the country, you'll vote. And to all the activists, we were like, we believed in the country so much we took to the streets because we tried to vote and voting didn't change the things we cared about, right? We emailed, called, we testified, we did all those things, and everybody told us it's coming. We shut down the street, and all of a sudden it's like the biggest issue in the country, right? But it wasn't until we shut things down that people sort of understood. And what I was trying to help him understand is that, like, if people understand voting as one of the many tools, they will be more inclined, young people will be more inclined to say, this is a tool I'll use in this moment. But the more and more we lie to people and say, like, voting is the way, it's like there are a lot of people who voted their whole lives and, like, it actually didn't turn into the world they wanted. So I think about voting as, like, incredibly important. The right to vote has been dampened in so many ways across the country, and people are doing incredible work to sort of undo that. But I think the narrative of voting is actually what we need to remind people of, that, like, when voting becomes one tool in a toolbox, I think there's a generation of people who are like, okay, I get it. I, like, know that, like, I protest, testify, and vote. When voting becomes like the only thing you do to show that you care, I think people just know that that's just not true. You know what I mean? And I get worried about that. And he participated in that logic. And it was hard to, like, shake him of that with the young, because there were a lot of people when Trump elected, there were a lot of people that I fought with. I remember I tried to endorse Hillary in the New York Times, and the editors of the New York Times, not Lauretta, were a nightmare. So I had to endorse her somewhere else. No shade to Lauretta, but they were bad. So I endorsed her on the Washington Post.
The opinion. I work in the newsroom. That's the opinion section.
So I endorsed Hillary, and people called me everything but a child of God. They're like, how could you endorse Hillary? The president doesn't matter. Voting isn't. And, like, it was nuts, right? Now those same people are, like, working on campaigns because the president clearly matters and is a nightmare. But it really was like a failure of the right message. And I think this is endemic of what happens on the left, is that people sort of live in this world that's disconnected from, like, what real people think, which is how a president could say, if you cared, then you must vote, not realizing there are a lot of people who have voted forever and, like, the world actually never got better for them. Yeah. Oh.
Over here, yes. Is there a mic over here?
Hiya. Hi, I'm from Charleston, South Carolina, And I remember when you went to protest after Mother Emanuel shootings, people said, they tweeted, "Go home, DeRay."
Yes.
I'm curious about where you found the strength to keep going after so many people tried to put you down for something that you obviously believe in and that I personally think is the right thing to do. How do you keep on? That makes sense.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about that is that it was easy. It's harder for me to do it now. Like now I have to actively think about it. When the protests were in the thick, it was sort of easy because we were so tunnel vision that like all I could see was what was in front of me, you know, like that. I woke up being like, this is the right thing to do. I'm here, da da da. I was like with people in communities that had just experienced this tragedy, you know, like it was easy in those early days or like in the first 450 days because the tunnel vision was so immense. I think it is harder when I live in a broader world that is not thinking about these issues all the time and I feel crazy. You know, I feel like I'm losing my mind when I'm like, I think the police just killed somebody. And they're like, DeRay, you're like, no, they just killed somebody. And whereas when we were in South Charleston, it was like everybody, like it was just easier in those moments, you know? So in these moments, like I just met with the police, one of the biggest police departments in the country. We just had a meeting. And they're doing better than they've ever done, but they still kill more people than any police department in the country. And I have to like really sit still and breathe so I don't lose my mind, you know, because I want to scream because I'm like, y'all kill a lot of people. And they're just like, we got better. And you're like, oh my God, like the families of the people you kill are not like, you got better. You know what I mean? So I'm actually struggling. I struggle more today than I struggled when the protests were happening. When the protests were happening, it was easy. It's now that I have to like remind myself every day. And one of the reasons I have perfected being calm is that people expect me to yell at them. Like when I go into a meeting, they are like ready for the drama. Like they want me to come in screaming because then they can be like, well, the protests aren't serious because like DeRay's angry. So I'm pretty calm these days, but inside I'm like devastated sometimes because like the problem is not better. And you see people who think that they can sort of think their way through it as opposed to feeling anything about the world. But Charleston was really wild. And you know, Muhyiddin, one of the lead organizers of the protests in Charleston, got killed in New Orleans randomly in the middle of the night, and which is such a loss because I was there when they first started organizing. We were in like a back house at like 3 a.m., like such incredible moments.
More questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm from Alabama. Welcome. This is a question for both of you, your definition of race. And the second question is, what role do you believe education plays as versus political outcomes and solutions?
So I don't have a hard and fast definition of race, mainly because I think it often changes. My role as the editor of Race Related is often to be a listener, and I champion some of our best reporting on how race and identity sort of affects the way we interact with each other. You know, when a shooting happens and there's a manifesto that authorities attribute to the suspect in which he says he is targeting Hispanic people because he thinks they're taking over the country and they're going to erase the white race. I mean, I'm taking all of that information in to help me as an editor judge a story and shape a story. So I don't think that there is a hard and fast definition. I will say I often get many reader letters that say there's one race, it's the human race, and it's like, that would be awesome if everybody believed that and really sort of, but that's just truly, it's bananas to think that everybody operates in this world thinking we are all equal and we are all the same, and that's why this conversation and conversations of race are so important. Education, hugely important to the work that I do, and I think access to education, I think right now we're seeing more schools that are they're self-segregating essentially, and so you have to kind of ask, like, what's motivating that? There was a big conversation that came out of the debates recently with Kamala Harris and Joe Biden on busing, and sort of how he opposed it and how she felt that busing really helped shape her her life and her future. So I'm the product of a public school education in Southern California. I feel like I got out of that school by the skin of my teeth. It was not a great school, but I did have a wonderful English teacher who was actually Scottish, and I'm going to see him while I'm out here. And those relationships really matter, but you know, and having faith in your students. But you have to get beyond all of these, you know, you have to get beyond a lot of bias that I think people have, you know, either they're holding on to them intentionally or not. It's there. I definitely have been subject to them as a black woman in the United States. I come from a family of educators, so I think education is a hugely important part of this conversation.
I think about race as like a system of power rooted in color and culture. And when I think about education, I was a teacher. I believe in the power of education to be an equalizing factor, but I'm mindful that people often use that as like a smokescreen to ignore the other institutional things. So, you know, I was a really good teacher. I taught my kids all of 6th grade math in the first 3 months of the year by Christmas. I taught 7th through 11th grade algebra from January to June. 40% of my students got the highest score you could get in the state of New York. The rest got the next highest score, right? Like, we did an incredible job in that classroom, but some of my students still went home and slept on the floor because they didn't live in houses where there were enough beds. Some of my students still went home hungry. Some of my students, like, their parents were unemployed, right? That, like, even the best of what we could do in the classroom didn't always set them up for success because, like, the larger institution and contextual things were designed to disadvantage them. So when I think about education, education can do cool things. I was a part of it doing cool things for kids, but that alone, like, actually can't correct the problem. Cool.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. This lady here, yeah.
Thanks. I was really struck by your contrast between the ally and the accomplice. And if I remember correctly, you said that it's about distance and also about being prepared to risk something. And I wondered if you could give an example of exemplary accomplice activity, what it would mean to be an accomplice.
So at home in the United States, we're having so the police are obviously a problem, not a surprise that I would say that, but we're having some issues where something will happen in a community. Recently we've had a spate of, like, black people doing things in public and people calling the police on them, right? So there was a cookout in this public park, black people having a cookout, white woman gets upset, calls the police on them, police come and do all this stuff. Is that what started to happen after those public incidents is that white people would see this happen, other white people, and they would intervene and be like, I can't believe you called the cops. They would call the cops on the person that called the cops. You know, it was like so when the police came, white people would get in front in the middle and say, like, this did not happen the way she said it, right? The alternative to that could have been like somebody standing in the corner taking a video being like, this was so bad. And you're like, I guess you videotaping it is better than you doing nothing. But, like, you intervening and, like, getting close to the problem, because when you do it, the fallout's going to be so different than when a black person does it. You know, when a black person does it, they're going to get arrested and tackled. When you do it, there's just going to be annoyed people, and you're like, fine, you know what I mean? And there are a lot of people who just don't think about their work in that way. They see the really bad thing happening, but the thought that they intervene or, like, put their body on the line or, like, do anything to take a risk is just so foreign to them, you know?
And with that, I want to thank you all for coming. If you want to learn more about what we do at the New York Times, you can visit us in the bookstore. And DeRay will also be signing copies of his book.
I'm going to put you guys on my Instagram. So here we go. We're going to do it in a second. 1, 2. Lauretta, you got to get ready. 1, 2, 3. Okay, you guys are boring, so make it better. Okay. Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you.
Cool. I'll see you guys.